state legislatures and the conventions are Jefferson and Madison talking about convention versus, or are they talking about the state as part of the Union saying, we don't like what you did?
They don't explain
Go that far.
They don't go that far. And again, this is Calhoun's utter brilliance.
But he's taking
He's taking it further, but he's mapping it all out. And in a way, and this gets back to the really interesting thing. The Constitution itself creates a federal union, right? And in order to create the federal government, the states have to give up a certain amount of their sovereignty, right? They have to. They're giving a certain amount of power that you cannot take power from a vacuum. If the states are going to, and if you're thinking, I hope you are, well, we're having a lot of arguments over state versus federal government right now and the power of government. I mean, we're replaying some of these arguments right now, and that to me is tremendously interesting. But the Constitution, nowhere in the Constitution does it say, oh, and by the way, a state can leave. By the way, a state can nullify a federal law. It doesn't say that anywhere. And so to take that next step, Calhoun actually develops what I've often described as almost like an extra-constitutional. It's extra-constitutional. It doesn't go against the Constitution. The way that he devises a secession convention or a nullification convention, because the way that he's going to nullify a law is exactly the way that you would secede. You get a sovereign body of the people together. It's not a legislature. It's the people who make the decision. If they can make the organic law, certainly they can unmake the organic law. That's Calhoun's conception. So if you take his idea is that if you take exactly the same process that you use to make the Constitution, to unmake an aspect of the Constitution or your allegiance to the Union, then that's okay. It's a brilliant, brilliant theory. But when he does that, Andrew Jackson is President of the United States. And my first two books are on Jackson. Jackson is no secessionist. He has devoted his life to the Union. He makes his fame as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And as a very young man, he fights in the American Revolution. And most of it, by the age of about 16, he's orphaned. And his mother is dead, both of his brothers die in the American Revolution, other family members die in the American Revolution, he's on his own. And so he has basically taken the Union as replacement of his family. And he's totally, totally devoted to it. And when Calhoun, anonymously, and nullifiers come out with this idea of you can nullify law and you can secede from the Union, Jackson responds with what is known as the Nullification Proclamation in 1832. And let me tell you, it is fiery. And he basically says, in no uncertain terms, you have no right to nullify, no state has a right to nullify a federal law, and no state has the right to secede from the Union. And my job as Commander-in-Chief is to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And if necessary, I will use the military to do so. And now he makes this, and he makes a very constitutional argument in the Nullification Proclamation. Well, Jackson is also very much I was going to say he's a saber-rattler, but he's more than a saber-rattler, because a saber-rattler gives a kind of connotation that all they'll do is rattle a saber. Jackson will do a lot more than rattle a saber. In fact, he declares to Senator Thomas Hart Benton, one of his followers, he says, if one drop of blood is shed in defiance of federal laws, I will ride down to South Carolina and I will hang the first nullifier I find on the first tree I see. And Senator Robert Hayne from South Carolina is in the Senate, and he hears this, and he walks over to Thomas Hart Benton and goes, do you think that Jackson really means about going down to South Carolina and hanging people? And Benton gives the perfect response. He goes, sir, when General Jackson talks of hangings, you can look for the rope. Okay? Because in 1818, Jackson had gone down and invaded Florida, Spanish territory at the time, captures 2 British citizens, has a drumhead court in the field, has 1 shot and 1 hanged from the yardarm of his own ship. So when Jackson talks about this stuff, you damn well better take him seriously. And so, it's very interesting because when secession does occur, Lincoln utilizes 3 documents to write the Declaration of Independence. Or, no, duh. He uses 3, let me try that again. He uses 3 documents to write his first inaugural address. And in the inaugural address, he talks about the perpetuity of the Union and the fact that you can't leave, and that his job as president is to maintain the Union, and that he's required to do that by his oath of office. And so he says, I'm not going to make war on the South, but if you insist on making war, I have no alternative but to defend the Union and maintain the Union. He uses 3 documents to develop his argument in his first inaugural address. One is the Declaration of Independence, one is Andrew Jackson's Nullification Proclamation, and one is, have you ever heard of the Hayne-Webster debates? Daniel Webster from Massachusetts and Robert Hayne from South Carolina get into a debate in the Senate over nullification, and Webster makes this very triumphal pro-union address in which he bashes nullification. And for a brief time, Webster and Jackson, who really didn't like each other, come together. So Lincoln becomes very wedded to Jackson as the great defender of the Union. Jackson at one point says, Calhoun and Jackson are at a Jefferson birthday dinner, which is celebrated. And it's still celebrated. The Jefferson-Jackson birthday dinner are still celebrated in Washington to this very day. And they're at this dinner, and there are specific toasts that are supposed to be given. And when it gets around to Jackson, he raises his glass, and he looks right at Calhoun. And at this point, they're not getting along as president and vice president. He looks directly at Calhoun and says, our federal union, it must and shall be preserved. And the story goes that Calhoun raises his glass right afterwards, and he's allegedly unnerved by Jackson's manliness. And a tiny trickle of sherry goes down the outside of his glass, and he says, the Union, next to our liberties, it is most dear. And so it's this standoff among these 2 luminaries over, is this Union going to be perpetuated? And so Lincoln ties himself to Jackson. And if you look at the famous portrait of Lincoln with his war cabinet in the Oval Office, and you look on the wall behind him, it's a portrait of Jackson. And there's a very good reason for that. Lincoln issues stamps of Jackson at the outset of the war. You can find newspapers all over the place. I find them in the Hartford Courant. What we need at the outset of the war, what we need is another Jackson. Okay? So, there's these very deep historical connections that exist within all of this. Yeah.
I went to a state dinner last month in Hartford, and it was something to do with it was, what's it called? It's called
the Jefferson-Jackson birthday dinner.
But it was in Hartford. It was.
Oh, yeah.
I went to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
I didn't realize it was Andrew Jackson.
No, it's a very, very traditional, democratic kind of organizer, fundraiser.
Yeah, I'm not a Democrat, but I was invited. But, yeah.
I
was invited, but I sat in the back with the $200 seats, not the $2,000 seats. But
I didn't even afford the $200 seats. There's a lot of history to all of this.
Okay.
So now let me back up and kind of shift again and connect to all of this, which again is really interesting. I had asked, do you think the South has the right to secede? And the important thing becomes, based on what? Because Calhoun argues that the South has the right to secede through these kind of extra-constitutional, a parallel route to the Constitution, these secession conventions. And that's the way every single Southern state goes about, that does secede, it's how they go about seceding. Okay? Sovereign body of the people. And this is really critical. The South does not declare independence, if you follow what I mean. They create a confederacy. Okay? They secede from the Union. They do not declare independence, meaning they do not simply write a Declaration of Independence the way that the original 13 colonies did to free themselves from Great Britain.
Is that because they didn't accept that the Union, that the federal government had that much power, that much authority?
It's not so much that, yeah.
Well, it seems like they're regressing to think about like the Articles of the Confederation, and they probably held that dear, and maybe a said before, decided to go for the Constitution, but with reservations.
Well, you look at the Confederate Constitution, it's virtually identical, except for certain key provisions, certain provisions like slavery.
They protect slavery.
Identical to the American Constitution.
They protect slavery,
Yes.
and they make the presidency a single term for 6 years. The rest of the Confederate Constitution is virtually identical to the federal Constitution.
What I hear you saying is that they don't need to declare independence because they never were an inutterable, irremovable part.
Interesting, but that's not exactly it. And the two things that you guys bring up are exactly where we need to go with this, because the South firmly believes that they are the ones who have followed the Constitution. And it's the North that has violated the Constitution. Okay? The Constitution of the United States protects slavery. No, there's just simply no question about it. Okay? There are 3 clauses in the Constitution that deal with slavery. Not one of them says the word slave or slavery, but it's very, very clear. One of them is what is referred to as the 3/5 clause. And that is where slaves are counted for population census purposes so that the South can get more representatives. Because the South is concerned that the northern population is so much larger than the southern population that they're never going to be able to compete in the House of Representatives. So they get this deal passed for a 3/5 clause. So every slave will be counted as 3/5 of a white man for census purposes, for representation. Okay? But they don't say slaves. They say person bound to others. Because Madison didn't want the Constitution to recognize the ownership of man within this seminal document in American history. One of the other clauses is the fugitive slave clause that says, if a person owing service to another escapes that service, they shall be returned to the person whose service is due. Okay? You run away from your slave master, you got to be returned. The last clause is that the international slave trade, bringing slaves from outside the United States, will not be ended for at least 20 years, until 1808. So all 3 of those clauses, none of them say the term slave or slavery, but all 3 of them in some way relate to slavery and are defending slavery. So without question, the U.S. Constitution supports slavery. And the South, and you get into big arguments between the North and the South over strict versus broad construction of the Constitution. And the key element that defines those terms is strict construction, and we get into these arguments today. What is constitutional, what is not? And for a strict constructionist, the government can only do what the Constitution specifically says it can do. So if the Constitution doesn't specifically say Congress may abolish slavery, then it can't. Okay? Broad construction says, well, if it doesn't specifically say you can't do it, well then you can. So it's a completely different reading of the Constitution. It's why the Bill of Rights are created. Because they want to have a specific list that says, government, you can't touch this. You can't abridge free speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. You can't, the right to bear arms, search and seizure, double jeopardy, all these things listed in the first 10 amendments are added to protect rights because they're concerned about broad construction. Does that make sense? Okay? So the South firmly believes that it's the North that's violating the Constitution by not following the Fugitive Slave Act the way they're supposed to, by trying to shut down slavery in the territories. And so Southerners are very sensitive to this, and they insist we're the ones who are strict constructionists. We're the ones who are following the Constitution